Well, thank you, Exiled Surfer, for the intro. Thank you, everybody, for jumping in. I think this is one of the most pressing topics of our time, even though the tools we build, the things we do should be outside of the control of the state. I think it's very important to keep an eye on what the state is trying to do to suppress privacy tools, suppress free speech, et cetera, and take some actionable, useful takeaways out of that. We only have to go back to really the seminal document on what it is to be a cypherpunk to see that we each should be deploring regulation on cryptography. And as I'll walk through with this presentation, it's very clear that the indictment against Tornado Cash and the sanctions a year before that have absolutely nothing to do with illicit usage of Tornado Cash and have everything to do with stopping privacy tools from existing because they strip power from the state and give power back to the individual. Now, a little bit of groundwork before we get too deep in here. If I say TC, or if you see TC in the slides, that just means Tornado Cash. It's a mouthful, and I'm going to have to say it about a billion times throughout this. So just so you're aware of what that is. Also, indictments are not convictions in the U.S. So those of you who aren't aware with how this process works, an indictment, especially by the U.S. Department of Justice, which is just a branch of the presidential office, can essentially indict on anything they want to. But that does not mean that the people are guilty of what's happened. That does not mean that they will be convicted. That doesn't mean there will be a plea deal, et cetera. And while that is important to keep in mind, I think it's best to plan for the worst and hope for the best in situations like this. And lastly, if the US justice system works properly, the founders will be innocent until proven guilty, and they will have to prove guilt in this case. But it doesn't always work the right way. So a little bit of background, you have to actually go back to 2022 to learn more about what the US government has been doing against the Tornado Cash project. And it's interesting that they've singled out Tornado Cash itself out of all of the potential privacy projects out there. But they started going after them in August of 2022 when they sanctioned the entirety of the project. They prevented US citizens from using Tornado Cash legally and eventually led to the takedown of all of the repos from GitHub, the takedown of every author's profile from GitHub and other repos that they had worked on. Eventually, those were restored after a lot of pushback, but initially it was a broad, sweeping sanction that we had never seen before. We had never seen an entire open source project sanctioned in this way. There's a really good article on the sanctions and details around that on a website called dark.com. I wrote the post on that as well. So you can dig into that if you want to, but we don't have time to get too deeply into that. But even after the sanctions, the usage of Tornado Cash continued. People could still use the web UI. People could still use the smart contract directly. It was still a usable and useful tool. And the US government doesn't like that. They show pretty clearly through both the sanctions and this latest indictment that if they cannot prevent the use of a tool technically, they're going to go after the people who made it, and they're going to try and put fear as a deterrent to other people building technologies like that. For the indictment itself, so the Tornado Cash founders have been indicted on 3 specific charges. One of them is running an unlicensed money transmission business. One of them is conspiracy to commit money laundering. And one of them is breaking US sanctions laws. There's a long name for that I cannot remember off the top of my head right now, but essentially it's sanctioned entities used your tool and thus you broke sanctions laws. And it's really just a continuation of government aggression against privacy tools. We'll look at briefly what I view as the previous precedent against privacy tools like this in the case of the Helix Bitcoin mixer a little bit later, but it's just continuing a stair-step path for the US government to continue suppressing privacy tools overall. Now, to properly understand the indictment, to understand how ridiculous it is, and to understand the precedent that a conviction specifically out of this indictment would set, you really have to understand what Tornado Cash is and how it works from a technical level. So we'll get into that. I won't go too deep into it, but it is really vital to properly understand what the indictment means and what it could mean for kind of the future of code as free speech, at least within the US. But Tornado Cash, very simply, it's an open source project. It was deployed on the Ethereum blockchain as a smart contract. And then it essentially provides Zcash style privacy to its users. So basically, you can view it as providing very good privacy for the sender, the receiver, and the amount in a transaction, assuming you use it properly. The downside with Tornado Cash is it's on Ethereum, which is a transparent ledger. And so if you don't use Tornado Cash properly, especially when you withdraw, you can reveal a lot of information about yourself or link back to the direct input, but that's a whole nother can of worms. But a very important piece is that even though initially the smart contract for Tornado Cash was deployed with an admin key that the Tornado Cash devs controlled, they removed this functionality in May of 2020. So from that point forward, the Tornado Cash founders had no ability to edit the smart contract at all. They could not add censorship. They could not suddenly start taking custody of funds. There was no ability for them to make any changes to the smart contract technically, which is, it's a really, really important piece, and we'll circle back to that a little bit later. Now, what was using Tornado Cash actually like? And you can still actually find UIs. I know there's some that are running on IPFS and other places. This is just a screenshot of what it looked like using the Wayback Tool. But essentially what you would do is you would choose a pool size right here. You would connect your wallet, MetaMask, whatever, and then you would deposit funds. Diving into the details there, this web UI was not the only way to access Tornado Cash. Because there's a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain, anyone with the necessary infrastructure and technical know-how, it's not simple, could actually just interact directly with smart contract and use Tornado Cash. But obviously, if there's a web UI that's drastically easier to use and has a lower barrier of entry, that's where most people are going to go. But you can actually still use the smart contract. Despite the sanctions, despite the indictments, if you have the necessary technical know-how, you can still use Tornado Cash today. But actually using it looked like this. You choose a pool size, 0.1, 1, 10, 100 Ethereum. You connect your Ethereum wallet, and then the important step is next. Essentially, the web UI locally generates a secret random number. You can think of it like a private key in Bitcoin, Ethereum, pretty much anything like that. It's the same basic concept. And it generates this number locally. That number is then considered your secret note within Tornado Cash. This secret note name is what Tornado Cash themselves use and what's used in the indictment. But this secret note is generated locally and it's never shared with any third party. The Tornado Cash founders never get it. It's never sent to the smart contract. It's never sent to relayers. The only person who has custody of your funds is the person who has the secret note. Just like the only person who has custody of your Bitcoin is the person who has your private key to your Bitcoin, your seed phrase, etc. Everything happens locally, not on the internet, not on the Tornado Cash servers, etc. So then you use the secret note, and essentially what you do is that you create a zero knowledge proof that says, this input is mine, I prove ownership of it, and I'm going to deposit it into this pool. You pass that proof in, and you deposit your funds into Tornado Cash. At that point, you still have custody of your funds, you have not relinquished custody, and you have not revealed the secret note to any third party. You're the only one who has it. The only thing that exists is a proof that these funds are yours that the smart contract knows. When you want to withdraw funds, you take that secret note again, and just like if you were to sign a Bitcoin transaction and send it to someone else, you go ahead and you take the secret note. Again, this isn't manual, it happens in the background with the software, but it's all done locally. You take the secret note, you create a proof that you own the specific input that you've put in, but you do it in a way that does not reveal which input is yours. So when you pass that proof to the smart contract, when you pass that proof to a relayer in the Tornado Cash ecosystem, they withdraw the funds. They are able to send the funds to the account that you specify, but they do not have custody. They have no control over those funds. And they also don't have visibility into which input into the pool was yours, which is the whole premise of how Tornado Cash's privacy works. And then, like we talked about, hopefully you withdraw to a fresh Ethereum address, but many people did not, reused accounts or funded their new account from their old account, etc. I think the last numbers I saw were something like 40% of withdrawals from Tornado Cash were compromised in this way. So unfortunately, most people did not gain the privacy that they could have through Tornado Cash, but again, that's not really a failing of Tornado Cash itself. And then this side caveat, which I only mention because the indictment talks heavily about relayers. Optionally, you can pay a relayer in the Tornado Cash ecosystem to fund this fresh Ethereum account for you, and you pay them a fee for the service. But just like with the smart contract, you do not reveal your secret note to them. You do not give custody to them. They cannot move funds for you. All that they get is the proof of which funds are yours and where they're going to go, and they have no ability to modify that. Now, the biggest takeaways, and I know that's a lot of like specific detail to go through when we're really talking about an indictment, but the biggest takeaways here are extremely pertinent to looking at the US government's case against the Tornado Cash founders. And there's three major ones. One is you never give up custody of your funds. In all previous cases of the US government specifically moving against privacy tools, Custody was the crux of their argument. That was exactly how they were able to pay in money transmission, money laundering, etc. In Tornado Cash, custody was never given up. Tornado Cash devs, founders, relayers, etc. never had the ability to move funds for users. You also never reveal the secret note to anyone. This is linked to custody, but a little bit different because essentially the indictment implies that when you use Tornado Cash, you're just handing the secret note in plain text to the smart contract, to relayers, to the Tornado Cash UI. But that is not at all the case technically. And there, you can look at the source code itself and prove that. That's outside the scope of today's talk. But the only way it works is you provide the proof. And lastly, and this is another one that's just specifically mentioned because of the indictment, they love to use this word commingling when they talk about Tornado Cash or other mixing tools. And well, if you talk about a mixing tool like Helix, which we'll touch on, technically they were just taking users' funds, mixing them up, and then sending someone else's funds to you. Tornado Cash does not work like that. The only funds that you get out of Tornado Cash are your exact funds. What you deposited, you withdraw. You never get anyone else's. They're never connected to anyone else's. They're only yours. So we walked through the charges already, so I won't go through them again, but they're back up here to remind you, because we're gonna walk through each of these charges and very easily dismantle them. I think it's kind of absurd how incorrect the indictment is on how it views Tornado Cash and the way that it's used. But these are the 3 charges that are being brought forward against the Tornado Cash founders, and the total is 45 years in prison, which is absolutely insane and sad that someone who creates a tool that's supposedly used for illicit services could face this, but this is what they're facing right now. So taking first the charge of an unlicensed money transmitting business. Interestingly, this is the charge that carries the least sentence. This is only 5 years in prison, which would make you think that it was the least important. But actually, the entirety of the argument of the Department of Justice hinges on this idea of being an unlicensed money transmitter. And there was a very good working paper, I'll have to link it to you later, I can share it with anyone who's interested, that essentially took the case of the Tornado Cash indictment and they walked through the existing guidance that we have from the US government that supposedly people who think they might be a money transmitter can go to know what they need to do to be compliant. Whether or not you should do that, all that's aside, but this is basically FinCEN's guidance, is that in order to be considered a money transmitting business, you have to have necessary and sufficient control over the value that's actually being transmitted through your tool. These are weird terms. We'll break them down. But essentially, we need to look at those 2 things. The 2 pieces of this argument are, do they have necessary and sufficient control? So if we look at necessary control, again, it's strange language, kind of legalese. But essentially what that means is if someone wants to use the Tornado Cash tool, do they need to use the service that you're providing? And in essence, we can basically say yes, that Tornado Cash founders themselves had necessary control because they created and deployed the smart contract. They ran the web UI, they ran some relayers and maintained the list of relayers. So they did have some necessary control in that in order to especially to most easily use Tornado Cash as a tool, you had to use the services they provided. But that's fine. Basically, every service provider in the cryptocurrency industry would be considered to have necessary control. I mean, if you use Bitcoin Core as a wallet, and that's the way you choose to move Bitcoin, you could consider Bitcoin Core to have necessary control of your funds. That's not a problem, so it shouldn't be scary that Tornado Cash fits that specific requirement here. But the second one is the big one, and that is sufficient control. Essentially, you can just think of this as custody. Did Tornado Cash have custody over the value that was actually being transmitted, and did they send and receive this value for their users? And this is where previously the precedent was set, is that if you did not have sufficient control, if you did not have custody of user funds, you were not a money transmitting business and thus did not have to do KYC AML, did not have to register with the MSB, you didn't have to do all of these things that come with being a money transmission business. So Tornado Cash did have necessary control, I would argue, but they did not have sufficient control. And I have no idea how you could truthfully argue that they have sufficient control based on how Tornado Cash works. So either the only guidance that we have from the US government is just totally void overnight with no warning, which is possible. Governments can do that, as hideous as it is. Or the US government just simply has no truthful argument to make in this case for Tornado Cash being a money transmission business. And once money transmission as the first charge, even though it's the smallest in terms of sentence, falls apart, the rest fall apart, because the idea of being a money transmitting business is what also gets tied to money laundering, and what also is the crux of the argument for the sanctions laws that were broken here. And if they were never actually transmitting value for anyone, thus they could not be laundering money, thus they could not be breaking sanctions laws. So that's an important one to break down, but we will hit the other ones just to better understand why every piece of this essentially makes no sense. When we look at money laundering, I think the last precedent that we can look at is the case of the Helix Bitcoin mixer. So the Helix Bitcoin mixer, I believe it shut down in 2017, but it was a well-known and supposedly pretty well-used Bitcoin privacy tool that was entirely custodial. Essentially, you sent in your Bitcoin to them, they took custody of the Bitcoin, they mixed around customer funds, and then they sent you someone else's Bitcoin after that. So this would very much fit exactly what we just walked through of what a money transmission business is, and thus money laundering, et cetera, et cetera. So in this case, the person who was charged as being the admin of Helix was Dean Harmon. And interestingly enough, it's a little bit of a tangent, but he has the craziest reason for being caught that I've ever seen in any case, in that he was administering Helix through Tor browser while wearing his Google glasses, and accidentally took a picture of the admin interface with his Google glasses, and it auto-uploaded to Google Photos. And so when they subpoenaed, because they thought he might be the admin of Helix, they got all of his pictures from Google, and one of them was a convenient picture with the Tor browser open to the admin page for Helix. So if you're going to do one of these tools, please don't wear Google glasses while doing it. But that one was pretty crazy. I also have an article on Helix, if you want the background there, that walks through the whole history of that and the case itself on dark.com. But when we look at that and we compare it to Tornado Cash, they are vastly different from a technical perspective. Helix, custodial, centralized, someone just running a server through Tor, taking custody of users' funds, mixing them, and sending them out. Should that be illegal? No, I don't think so. But that aside, that very clearly fits what the US government does not want people to do. And that case, unfortunately, was pretty open and shut once they proved Dean Harmon was the admin of Helix with the nice picture he provided. He essentially pled out and is an FBI informant to this day, which is another interesting piece of that one. And unfortunately, most of these cases end in a plea deal and either becoming an informant or having a shortened sentence as a result. Tornado Cash, on the other hand, non-custodial. They never have custody of user funds. They do not mix user funds in any way. While people can enter a pool and they gain privacy through the collective set of users within that pool, no funds are mixed, no funds are transferred, nothing is moved around. You simply enter the pool, never give up custody, withdraw from the pool, never give up custody. So it does not fit this precedent of Helix as something that's used for money laundering or money transmission. And I think we can kind of hammer home this idea of how absurd these claims are if we talk about it in the sense of like traditional finance. So US banks, really banks worldwide, by far the biggest money launderers. Cash, by far the biggest thing that's being laundered. Banks are complicit, they make money off of it, they get slaps on the wrist that are far less than the value of what they're making on laundering money. Most of us probably already know that. But think about that specific scenario. So a bank charged with laundering money, do they also go after the manufacturer of armored trucks who helped to move that cash? The armored truck manufacturer is not the one taking custody of funds. They're not the one driving it. Usually it's a third-party security service. So they don't have custody, but you could argue they have necessary control if we look at that FinCEN guidance. They make the truck, and the truck is necessary to move the laundered cash. But does the US government ever go after armored truck manufacturers for money laundering? No, because that would be absolutely patently absurd. So I think it helps to have a little bit of an idea of how this would fit in the traditional financial sense. But for some reason, the US government thinks that once we move into the digital and once we move into the concept of providing privacy to actual people and not just laundering money of wealthy criminals, things just suddenly shift. So now the big, scary boogeyman charge. And this one, I think, is less impactful from the sense of how their actual court case will go down, but I think is the easier sell to the populace, and that you can say that Tornado Cash is evil because they, and this is a quote from the indictment and the specific charge, they knowingly and willfully aided North Korean hackers to launder funds. So this one is the one that they're going to use to try to pin Tornado Cash as an evil tool, with the Tornado Cash founders as evil tools, because they're supporting these these evil North Korean hackers that are running rampant through the Ethereum ecosystem. I think that's the approach that they're going to take. But in order to claim this knowingly and willfully aiding of North Korean hackers, they have to prove that that actually happened. And we can actually look at the exact opposite, which is what did the Tornado Cash founders do to prevent this sort of usage, and what could they technically have done? If we go back, we talked about it very briefly before, there's a web UI, there's a smart contract on Ethereum. The web UI can be censored. The Tornado Cash founders actually, within 24 hours of the initial sanctions against the North Korean hackers who were using Tornado Cash, they implemented a Chainalysis OFAC sanctions block list. So you would think, we don't want sanctioned users using it, we implemented your block list, we're good. Unfortunately, that's never how it works, but they implemented that and they censored the web UI. What they could not do is they could not censor the smart contract. This blacklist happened 2 years after they had essentially purged the admin keys from the smart contract. So they have no ability to put any sort of censorship, any sort of a change to take custody into the smart contract. They have no way to prevent anyone from using the smart contract. They can't prevent you or I from using it, and they most definitely cannot prevent North Korean hackers from using the smart contract itself. And when we look at this, it's really interesting in the indictment because you can walk through it and the Department of Justice says exactly nothing about how the North Korean hackers use Tornado Cash. Even though in this case, I think one of the most important details is did the North Korean hackers use the web UI or did they use the smart contract? Because web UI was censorable, even though the actual ability to censor complex and skilled hackers from a web UI that can shift funds around in Ethereum, new accounts, et cetera, is a whole nother topic. They have no way to stop the smart contract. So if the North Korean hackers were using the smart contract, I don't see any way that they can claim that they knowingly or willfully aided North Korean hackers. But all of that aside, I think pondering this last question is really, really helpful because these are hackers. This is specifically the Lazarus group, which is a hacking group that's theoretically out of North Korea that have been performing hacks within the Ethereum ecosystem for years. I think the last tally I saw is they're responsible for something like $2.5 billion in theft through hacks in the Ethereum ecosystem. And do we really think that this highly skilled group, whose entire mandate from their government is to attack the Ethereum ecosystem and steal funds, would not know how to run an Ethereum full node and not know how to interact directly with a smart contract? Because that essentially is what the government will have to claim in order to say that the Tornado Cash founders could have prevented them from using it and yet didn't put those measures in place. And now kind of starting to step back a little bit and look at the bigger picture here. I think that we can, by breaking down exactly what's being charged here and by breaking down how Tornado Cash works, I think we can start to pull back the veil. Because the only way that this indictment goes across and fools the general populace or fools a jury or fools a judge is that they don't actually see how Tornado Cash works, that they don't actually understand how any of this functions, and thus they can be misled into thinking that the Tornado Cash founders were these evil, complicit people as part of this. But it's clear that the government cannot technically stop Tornado Cash. If they could have just gone to a server or gone to Ethereum validators and said, this smart contract is dead, it is gone, you must erase it, it cannot exist anymore, they would have done that. It's much easier for them to technically shut something down. And almost always what happens first in a case like this is they go and technically stop the tool, and then they arrest the people behind it, and then they prosecute them. That's the case of almost everything, except for the, I can't think of the name of the tool, but I'll skip that for now. But basically that's always the precedent that they take. Here, they haven't tried at all to technically stop the tool. They actually haven't even technically asked the Tornado Cash founders to implement any measures to prevent illicit usage of the tool. Their implementation of the Chainalysis OFAC sanctions list was entirely on their own and without any prompting by the US government. But instead, they've pivoted to leveraging essentially the judicial system in America as a way to strike fear in the hearts of developers, to strike fear in the hearts of users, to prevent us and to prevent other people who are seeking privacy from using those tools because they don't want to be lumped into the category of North Korean hackers and seen as complicit in this. So that is the tactic that I think is very clear, but the implications out of this that people who create free and open source tools and deploy them in a way that is uncensorable can somehow be held liable for the actions of those who use these tools would be a horrifying precedent and one that goes directly against everything that we previously have of code is free speech, et cetera. But reminder, thankfully, this is just an indictment. So if the justice system works properly, this should be just summarily shot down in open court. A positive precedent should be set. But obviously, we can't assume that that's actually going to happen. So wrapping up here, we'll get to kind of the actionable takeaways, and I definitely want to have time to do open Q&A, because I hope that there will be a lot of questions out of this, since it's a very important topic. But looking again, Cypherpunk Manifesto, privacy only extends so far as the cooperation of one's fellows in society. If we are shut down, if our free speech is chilled, if our actions and usage of privacy tools is destroyed because of the fear tactics that the US government is using, we strip the ability for others around us to gain privacy. That could be in more authoritarian regimes, that could be anywhere in the world with any kind of cause behind it. But if we stop using and creating these tools, we harm the privacy of everyone else. It's not just a personal decision for us, as much as I would like it to just be a personal decision. And ultimately, I think that we have to continue to build and use accessible and useful privacy tools. Really, like, the point of this talk is not that we just sit around and think philosophically about what this could mean, about what the future could be here, because I don't also want to perpetuate this chilling effect and this idea of, like, maybe we should think twice before we create this tool. But rather is that we actually take this and we take action out of it to resist even more, because we see the oppression of the state. So few takeaways, and we'll wrap up. Very first one, and thanks to Exiled Surfer for this one, we were talking Thursday night before the conference started, and we were talking about all kinds of regulation and privacy crackdowns and the difficulty of using privacy on Bitcoin and Ethereum. And it quickly kind of could take a depressing bent, but Exiled Surfer did a great job, like, pulling it back up and pointing out that the fact that we are facing these challenges, the fact that the US government is going out of its way to make a public indictment through the Department of Justice on a privacy tool, it means we're winning. It means the tools that we're making are actually making a difference, are actually stripping away their power and actually giving it back to the individual. If Tornado Cash did not work, they would not go through this process, because they do take risks in making an indictment of this type, especially with how detached it is from reality. So that, I think, if nothing else, hopefully we take away this idea that we should be optimistic and that we are winning, and that the fight is only further evidence of that winning. Secondly, just let your voice be heard. This is something that everyone in here, no matter your technical capability or not, you can leverage your sphere of influence. That could be social media, that could be a local meetup, that could be a local hackerspace, whatever that is. Leverage it to let your voice be heard on this specific topic about Tornado Cash, because I think it is vital that this is one where we make a concerted effort around how we approach it and how we talk about it, but also just generally to continue talking about the necessity for privacy tools, what we need privacy tools to include, which, especially like we've seen in Tornado Cash, is censorship resistance and how positive that can be. But just that we continue to use our voices to support causes like this. Third is just support people who are building these tools, support people who are creating these privacy preserving projects, because oftentimes building out these projects is a very thankless job. Not to mention, it's usually not a financially lucrative job, especially these smaller open source projects. So the way that you can support them, obviously donations. Donations are huge. Almost all of the projects that I know of in the space, except Bitcoin and Monero and usually other cryptocurrencies as well. So there are ways to donate to them without revealing information about yourself or without having to deal with fiat. But the first step is donate if you can. I understand not everybody can, but donate if you can. And the second one is really send encouragement to the people building these tools. Like, the majority of what they see are bug reports and people who hate something about their project. Imagine if everyone in this room thought for a few minutes after this talk, thought about what are the most used privacy tools in my toolkit, and just send them an email, open an issue on GitHub, whatever the proper method is to get in touch with them, and just let them know how helpful their tool has been, how much you see it providing you individual freedom, and just give them some encouragement to keep building. Like, this goes a long ways, even though it's not a tangible thing. It goes a long ways to keeping people in the fight, because oftentimes it is a very thankless job.
So I want to pick out a specific piece first from this when we talk about knowfully and willingly. So the defense or the argumentation rests primarily on the fact that at the time that they deployed the smart contract and then burned the keys to it, there was no legal precedent that forbade such an act. And secondly, privacy-preserving technology is deployed with the intent to obfuscate in the open the ability to stop any such behavior for whatever use, good or bad, yeah? So can the argument be made that they knowfully and willingly did that, which then later enabled the South Korean hackers or North Korean hackers or not? Hey, listen, man, you guys are all going to get older too, all right? So just...
I mean, I certainly think they could make that argument, and I think that's likely the only argument that they can make, that essentially just the publishing of a tool that could be used for illicit means is knowingly and willfully aiding the people who use that tool later on. But not only does that break completely from the rest of the precedents that I know of, at least within the legal system, and I'm not a lawyer, so obviously I could be missing something, but it would set the worst possible precedent for future projects, because you could claim, I mean, you can blow this claim up in a massive way. Think about it beyond privacy tools. Think about it if Microsoft ships Microsoft Excel and North Korean hackers use Microsoft Excel to keep track of their hacks. Would not then Microsoft be complicit in the act of breaking sanctions laws? There's no limit to this if you open it up beyond the idea of custody, which is the previous precedent. Even if that is bad, I think that is the previous precedent. But if you open it up past that, there's really no limit, because essentially it means that anyone who develops any tool, it's especially digital for some reason, is then liable for any way that it's used no matter what, even though there's no way for them to prevent that usage. I mean, Tornado Cash is a clear example of that, but any tool you can think of, if a terrorist goes on Google search and looks up how to build a bomb, is Google then complicit?
So let's pull exactly those examples into the conversation. I never understood why those of us that are, so libertarian and free speech absolutists haven't grasped to the argumentation that the National Rifle Association uses in the manufacturing of guns. And we also have Cody Wilson here today, and we'll also be showing the film Death Athletics later tonight. So we have also in our community, people who have been actively working on this. Do you see those legal precedents and the fight that Cody has gone through as being relevant to the Tornado Cash argumentation legally? Yeah,
I would certainly hope that those can be used in this case by their defense lawyers, because again, this is a very broad precedent, even though it's software specifically here, as essentially saying that any tool that's used for evil, the manufacturer is liable. And yeah, I mean, it would make sense then to also apply it to guns, to also apply it to car manufacturers, whatever you want. Because if a terrorist drives a car into a crowd of people and kills them, is the car manufacturer liable? The whole system that we use to think about liability and specifically illicit usage would fall on its head. And I think there should be clear alignment here between, even if you're not a gun-toting NRA member, there should be clear alignment in this concept of the manufacturer of a tool that can be used for good, that could get used for evil, and maybe does get used for evil, should not be liable for the way that that's used. I think that should be pretty clear.
So the next thing, you're working together with Foundation Devices now. So you also have a perspective on how it is that you're implementing privacy solutions at the wallet level. Since you've so gratefully assisted us in making this happen, why don't you take a few minutes to talk about the privacy features of the Foundation Passport?
Yeah. Do we have time for other questions?
We totally have the time, but I
just wanted to make sure
a short one. We've got a good 20 minutes.
Yeah, I'll actually kind of. Maybe. There we go. Okay. Yeah, I'll actually not focus on Foundation, even though so I work at Foundation Devices. I'm head of strategy and marketing, but my real passion is education and content creation. That's why I joined the team. That will always be the crux of why I do what I do. And the the people behind Foundation have been amazing. And essentially they said, we want you to build what you see as the biggest need in the space. And one of the needs that I see is there's not really a single publication where you can go to get a proper understanding of all of the freedom tech at our disposal. This is not just cryptocurrency tools. This is not just private messengers. I want this to be a broad category of any technology that really empowers you as an individual. So if you would take a moment, go to freedom.tech. It's not technically live yet, but the site's already up and we'll be announcing it next week. I would love to get your thoughts and feedback. And specifically, if you have something you want to write about, if you want to write about Tornado Cash, if you want to write about a tool that you're building, a project that you've started, the goal here is not that it's a unilateral publication where Seth for Privacy shares his thoughts. The goal here is that I would be able to fade into the background and the voices of all the people building these powerful tools or using these powerful tools would make it into something that is a useful net positive for society. So that's the main thing I'll focus on. To briefly mention Foundation. So what we do is we build Bitcoin-centric tools that allow you to reclaim your freedom. That's our focus right now. Our main product is a Bitcoin hardware wallet, but we have 2 new big products in the works, hopefully released by the end of the year. But our goal is always to do it in a way that is intuitive and user-friendly, but is not a walled garden. We're not going to be the Apple where we lock you into an ecosystem, but we want to get some of that usability and bring freedom tech into the hands of drastically more people around the world.
Cool. So, questions?
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there's anything that the devs could have done differently to reduce their chance of being indicted.
Not build Tornado Cash, but that's a terrible reality. I mean, if you're looking for like regulatory compliance, like they could have built privacy pools, but I didn't mention it here today because I just don't have time. But I think the concept of privacy pools is exactly what the U.S. government wants this indictment to create. They want to force the brilliant minds behind these privacy tools to build tools that are built for regulators, to build tools that are for self-regulation, to build tools that lock us in a golden cage. And that is exactly what they want out of this. So I think
that's exactly what's happened already. We already have a paper from Vitalik and Amin and others.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is a direct outpouring of this, and that they see the fear. They think that they are not these people who are using things illicitly. So they think that they can get away with building a tool that will expose illicit usage, supposedly. But ultimately, all that privacy pools does is it means that every user is guilty until proven innocent. Because if you choose not to reveal what subset of users you are, necessarily you must be a bad guy, because only bad people would hide when there's simple tooling for you to reveal exactly who you are on chain. So I think that the only real alternative would be to build a tool that just gives power back to the state, which is problematic. So there's no real way they could have built a tool that's useful for privacy while also being a compliance tool, because those things are a juxtaposition. They cannot exist together.
Yeah, so more comment than question. I've spoken to lawyers who are actively focused in the space, and if you read the indictment, they had internal communications where they said they were knowingly laundering money, and they also were making money off of this, which is making this much more likely that they'll actually be successful with the conviction. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think it will also highlight how one could build a tool that would be outside of kind of legal jurisdiction. As far as privacy pools are concerned, I mean, I think it's a little bit unfair to those guys. I've spoken to one of the authors, and they're trying to maximize privacy within the confines of not going to jail.
I understand the cause is noble, but I think it's a very solar punk approach to things, in that it essentially says this will not be misused, and thus we can build a tool that can benefit us for now, but it doesn't view the worst case scenario and plan for that.
No, I mean, look, I gave a talk earlier this week basically saying that the entire financial surveillance system is crap and should be gotten rid of because it's useless. But I think I'm not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, in that privacy pools is going to be better than nothing.
Yes.
My hope is that when this gets sussed out, and potentially there's another lawsuit involving the validity of Chainalysis as well, my hope is that you'll end up seeing a roadmap to building a Tornado Cash that, with a hopefully straightforward interface that could not easily cause developer pain. And I suspect that there will be very clear demarcations between the free speech publishing aspects of this and the alleged criminal conspiracy aspects of it. And while I hope that it goes where these guys don't get found guilty, I do think that even if they do, the government will have to make very, very clear, specific arguments in order to get a conviction that will pave a way for us to build a Tornado Cash 2 that's not something that creates legal jeopardy for the devs. And obviously, I guess that the devs should be more anonymous too, just as a best practice.
Yeah, so two quick things on that. First, just as far as them making money, while they did build a profitable business out of Tornado Cash, it did not get profit directly from illicit usage, and that there was not a direct mechanism between North Korean hackers using Tornado Cash and them making money, especially if these North Korean hackers use the smart contract directly, which it would be in their best interest to do. So I hope that there will be good arguments there in court about how, even though they built a profitable business, that had nothing to do with money laundering itself. And then as for privacy pools, I think you are right that it is better than nothing. If there is no privacy tool on Ethereum, that is a worse outcome than privacy pools existing. But I think the problem with privacy pools is that it builds the slipperiest of slopes, in that it essentially says that if a privacy tool will not build in simple regulatory compliance, and if users will not give over their financial activity to whoever requests it, that those things are bad. And if you read through the white paper, that is explicitly what they are saying. They're saying that tools that do not implement regulatory compliance are a bad thing. And that, I think, is a very, very, very dangerous precedent. And I would be interested to see if even that specific approach, privacy pools, is brought up as a tool against the Tornado Cash founders in the court case. Whether that'll happen or not, obviously, I'm not Nostradamus. I don't know what's going to happen there, but that will be something that will be interesting to see play out.
Speaking of Nostradamus, do you see any of these sort of arguments being applied against the protocol developers of Nostr, which, I mean, essentially have, a certain payment mechanism on a messaging protocol, which enables essentially the same thing?
I think probably not, because the concept of a social media platform is very different and much harder to prosecute. Something that moves money is there's a long precedent of persecuting things that allow money to move outside of the state's control. But free speech is quite a bit different. They certainly could. I mean, again, if this precedent goes through, who knows? It could prosecute anything. If people are collaborating on illicit usage on a Nostr relay, does that make them liable? Like, it certainly could open the door for that. But I think, thankfully, at least for now, the concept of like general free speech and free speech as in money are very different from a legal perspective.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have a quick question regarding, are you aware of general purpose tools such as Etherscan has engaged any censorship on these addresses or any future addresses related to it?
I know that they tag them and make users aware and allow people to essentially pull in block lists from them. I don't know. I mean, they don't have a way to actually censor usage of tools, but they can make people aware of what addresses are sanctioned, what tools are sanctioned, et cetera. So I don't know of any specific censorship there. Yeah, I guess that's it. Sorry.
Does anybody in the room have any direct experience with seeing the KYC interface that is pretty much implemented across all legal businesses? I mean, some of us have gone through a KYC, right? Yeah. I mean, they pretty much know pretty much everything about you. If you're KYC'd or your data has been linked between your addresses in Ethereum by using, ENS and talking about it and stuff. I mean, all of that data is scraped and is available in the interface that every time you individually do a transaction at any level, there is a rating system for your wallet. So, I mean, it's pretty forward about how much they know about that. And they're grabbing all of that information from Etherscan and Block Explorer tools and whatever is being provided. Next question.
Hey, so in the indictment, there's also an argument about how they didn't properly implement AML and KYC since they are a money transmitting business. And that comes from the Bank Secrecy Act, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess there's two things here. Do you see a way to defend that? And also, do we need to re-examine the way we are actually designing things? Like, because privacy pools basically assumes that the Bank Secrecy Act is
good,
not questionable.
Yeah.
Right?
Awesome question.
Yeah. I think it's a really good one. I think for the specifics around implementing KYC AML, those laws do not apply if you're not a money transmitting business. So that's why I think the clearest defense against them not implementing enough rules and regulations is to say that they're not a money transmitting business, which I think there is a very sound argument for that based on precedent, based on FinCEN's guidance themselves. I'm hopeful that that will be successful in the actual case because I think it should be. And if you are able to argue that they're not a money transmitting business, they have no legal requirement to implement KYC AML or any of that. But I mean, like, even if you argue that they are a money transmitting business and that they should have implemented some measures, the government never told them what measures to implement. They did implement specifically an OFAC sanctions list in response to the sanctions, but they couldn't stop anyone from using the smart contract. They couldn't implement KYC AML in the smart contract. So even if they had shut down every aspect of the business and North Korean hackers had still used the smart contract, would they still be complicit in that case, even though they have no technical ability to implement that? So I think that's going to be interesting to see how the government argues that and how their defense argues that. But to me, I don't see a way that you can argue based on any existing law or regulation that they were a money transmitting business and thus were supposed to put in KYC AML.
I think that the argumentation is really like we're kind of like, pissing in the bathtub, so to speak, because the message is clearly, a chilling one. It's the same message that we've gotten with Ross, same message that we've gotten with Assange, same message that we're getting here with Tornado Cash. This process, and it will take how many years to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, right? By the time this is actually literally challenged at the top of the legal scale in America, which it will inevitably be, I believe.
Hope so.
The tech will have long surpassed it, and the state of the network will probably be, far beyond, what the legal precedent that's going to be getting set.
Yeah,
I believe.
I just hope that during that time, it doesn't stop people from building tools, because I think that's their main.
It's clearly not.
Yeah,
it's clearly not.
So far for people here, but that's why also I want people to keep talking about it outside of this, because like in my circles, no one's talking about Tornado Cash indictment anymore. Like it disappeared. No one on Twitter that I'm involved with, no communities that I'm a part of are mentioning this anymore. And I feel like it is such a massive deal for us and for the people who want to actually use privacy tools that it should be something that we continue to discuss and get outside of our bubble. It has to get outside of our bubble for governments to take notice.
Next question.
Yeah, I have two. I don't know if I missed it, but were they anonymous or trying to be anonymous?
No, they both publicly claim that they were founders of Tornado Cash.
So what are your thoughts about doing a project anonymously versus doxed is my first question, and I have a second.
Yeah, I think this is something that I've gone back and forth on since the indictment. I think the safer play is always to do it pseudonymously or anonymously. But there are drawbacks in that, and that it can be a lot harder to gain traction for a project like this. When it's open source, that is offset quite a bit because people can actually just check the code and make sure it does what it's supposed to. But there are benefits to not being anonymous. I mean, I am not anonymous on purpose. I could be, but there are a lot of benefits to actually being willing to show my face, willing to go on podcasts, willing to talk about this stuff publicly, even though it does imply some personal risk. Obviously less for me as an educator than someone actually building these tools. But I think there is something to be said of the law should protect fully identified, fully known creators of open source projects from liability of how their tools are used when they could not actually prevent it. So you should be able to build these things out in the open. And if you cannot, that is a very bad statement about the state of society. But I do think, like, my default for people is that you should start anonymous or pseudonymous. And if you have a very clear, very pertinent reason for revealing who you are and publicly associating yourself with something that's a privacy tool, you just need to make sure. Don't start there and then decide you want to go pseudonymous or anonymous, because that gets much harder.
Okay, thank you.
And we don't have many examples of people who've actually achieved remaining anonymous.
Yeah.
It's pretty hard to remain anonymous. If you're pseudonymous, you're doxed. There's not, it
depends.
It's very rare case to have a completely clean identity and trail. Yeah. The question is a jurisdictional one and a resources one if they actually want to go after you. And we do have, like, if they want to go after Kim.com, they went after Kim.com. If they want to black bag anybody, they will black bag somebody. The question is whether they're going to put the resources into it. But I agree that generally, if you're going to work on something like this, start with the best possible security practices. Your next question?
Geo-blocking, like blocking US. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's just one of those preventions that's so easy to work around. It's kind of asinine to expect it to do anything, but yeah, the US government loves for people to geo-block US citizens. And I believe Tornado Cash did geo-block IPs from the US. I can't remember that for sure, but I'm pretty sure that was one of the steps that they implemented as well. But that's like, I mean, a 10-year-old kid these days could get around to geo-block. So it's like the simplest of things to work around. Really, like on-chain blacklisting theoretically is better, but even that, anyone who has any experience in the ecosystem can quickly get around these accounts are banned because it's quite easy to disassociate yourself with the banned account and still be able to move funds. So like all of these means are very difficult to actually implement in a useful way, which only unfortunately empowers the government because then they can say, even though you did the thing we wanted you to, you didn't do it well enough because they still used it, even though there's no way for you to actually prevent this usage.
I saw a great piece of humor a couple of days ago about what it means to be a developer in the DeFi ecosystem on Ethereum, and it's primarily geo-blocking your American customers and making sure that you don't get hacked by North Koreans. Well.
Very applicable.
Do we have another question? Please.
So I'm literally the developer in that, not clearly DeFi, but those area. And my question is, what idea made the developer delete their admin wallets? And if, let's say, if they still have the ownership of the admin wallet, then if they have to implement some blocking feature to update the contract, if they have, or like, my question is, what idea made them delete their
administrative control over the contract?
Yeah,
control.
so one quick clarification. I think a lot of times people think of it as they just like press delete on a wallet file to not have the admin keys anymore. But actually the way that it worked is that they edited the smart contract and deployed a new one that had the admin key set to just a null key that no one can use. So it's impossible for anyone to be the administrator of the Tornado Cash smart contract. And they did that intentionally because if you just said, we deleted the admin keys, which I'm sure that's happened in DeFi. But if you just said that, obviously you could still have them. There's no way to prove that you do not have the admin keys anymore. So that wouldn't be really a useful mechanism. As for why they did it, from my understanding, and I haven't been deeply embedded in the Tornado Cash community or involved in those conversations, but from my understanding, the goal all along was for it to be an immutable privacy tool that no one had control over. And I mean that, from my understanding, and I'm not deeply in the Ethereum ecosystem, that should be the goal of almost everything, is that it's something that cannot be censored. And I think they saw clearly that a privacy tool like this would face headwinds in the future. So if they didn't have access, in theory, they would be somewhat detached in a legal sense because they couldn't add in these changes that would be required of them moving forward. And they could say, look, we shipped it, we can't change it. Like, I don't know what you want from us.
It's the primary discussion about decentralization that we have with DAOs, where project maintainers retain keys to deployed contracts, for Treasury management and whatever. So there's a culture inside of Ethereum where you have users and commenters, the commentariat saying, okay, well, who has control over? It's not decentralized unless the admin keys are burned. So I mean, it's a pretty well established thing and discussion in Ethereum. This really, every project suffers from this. Who has control over the admin keys over contracts in Ethereum? And we don't really have that discussion in Bitcoin much, except for around federated networks. Next question.
Yeah, so while it's fairly clear that the developers couldn't censor these transactions, someone who could would be the block producer, right? Mm-hmm. So why haven't we seen them go after the block producers?
I mean, my only guess is that it's difficult enough to not be worth their time if they think that taking a case against people in the US where they have control over the judicial system can have enough of a chilling effect and can have enough of an effect of putting fear in people's minds so they don't build or use these tools. I think that's the lower hanging fruit for them than going after Ethereum validators. Because I mean, they could, in theory, go after Ethereum validators. How that would actually play out, I don't know. I mean, there's already been an appetite shown for censorship within Ethereum validators. We've seen that from pretty much day one. So maybe they could get them to go ahead and implement some sort of block list. And even validators were preventing some transactions that interacted with the Tornado Cash block list from using Tornado Cash. That has been part of what they've censored because some of them implemented OFAC sanctions list. So it's something they could have done, but it's a lot easier to bring a case against two known individuals that are responsible for the tool itself, even if they should bear no legal liability for that, rather than to go after the validators themselves. And I think it's important that the US government does not need to win this case. While winning this case would set the best precedent for them and not for us, they don't have to win it. All they have to do is drag it out in the courts and stop us for 4, 5, 6 years from building or talking about these things. And that's them winning. Even if they lose the case, even if theoretically a positive precedent for us gets set, they still win because they've delayed that and they've allowed themselves to continue building CBDCs, whatever kind of surveillance tech they want, in a vacuum because we haven't filled that space. So I think that's really important to remember as well, that even if they could maybe technically go after validators, the lowest hanging fruit is prosecuting known people behind the project.
To be fair, there is, inside of the Ethereum community, the criticisms about the centralization of Infura and the fact that huge amount of validator sets are running on Google Cloud infrastructure. I mean, a huge amount of software is deployed on companies that are under American jurisdiction. And if it were to push came to shove, there is quite a way to go after the validator sets and, Lido Finance with staking and everything. I mean, there is discussions about this, and it's one of the criticisms of the weakness of the POS model and the validator model is it's a potential point of.
And I also wonder, and I think it's something worth pondering, does the US government benefit more from breaking the Ethereum ecosystem entirely or from allowing it to run but with a distinct lack of privacy? Because I think that's something you have to consider too if you're considering, well, they could go after validators, why don't they? But if they go after validators, it breaks the entire model of Ethereum. And it quickly becomes clear that Ethereum is not censorship resistant. The whole model breaks down and maybe people stop using it. So again, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but maybe the government prefers Ethereum to exist in a way that does not allow users to gain privacy.
I always use the argument that Germany loves Kreuzberg because they know where everybody is. Yeah, so you have relative freedom and of action in Kreuzberg that you don't have other places in Germany. It's kind of like a little bit more autonomous and free. But the reason is because we know that that's where it's going on, and anything that's a little bit too out of whack, then we step on it in. I would make the same agreement for Ethereum. Yep. Seth for privacy. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.